Newmarket, 1886. A single gunshot disturbs the calm of an end-of-season afternoon. The Suffolk town, the headquarters of British flat racing, has run its final meeting of the year and will fall into hibernation before rousing for the start of the 1887 season the following spring.
But one of horse racing's leading players will not return in the spring. Fred Archer, 13-time champion jockey, 5-time Derby hero and the winner of 2,748 races, lies dead on the floor of his palatial home in the Snailwell Road. At 29, one of the turf's most celebrated lives has been brought by Archer's own hand to a premature and tragic end.
But how did a timid 11-year-old boy, scared of the dark and bullied by his peers, become one of the greatest jockeys of all time and arguably the biggest sporting star of the Victorian era? What made him such a force in the greatest race of all, the Derby, to the extent he could almost name the price for his services when bargaining with the aristocracy? Who were the women in Archer's life, and how did the whiff of scandal threaten to obliterate his status as the hero to a horse racing mad nation? And what was the chain of events that led to his violent death less than 3 months before his 30th birthday? A life toasted by followers of flat racing has its beginnings in the midst of national hunt country.
Frederick James Archer was born here at St George's Cottage, St George's Place, Cheltenham, on the 11th of January 1857. He was the fourth of 5 children born to William Archer, a jump jockey who would win the Grand National the following year, and his wife Emma. Billy Archer was a squat ball of a man. He boasted little education and even less refinement. But when the young Freddie's mother expressed concerns that the boy's schooling was losing out to hours spent on horseback, it was Billy Archer who won the Battle of Wills. "Let the lad alone," he barked. "He'll make more out of his riding than he ever will out of book learning." Billy Archer was pig-headed and bombastic, but he was also right. The adult Fred's literacy extended scarcely beyond the ability to scrawl his own name, but when the Inland Revenue took an unwelcome look into the jockey's fiscal affairs in 1885, its conservative estimate of his earnings for that year was £10,000. That's more than £1 million today.
Billy Archer, whose sons William and Charlie would also have careers with horses, packed up riding in 1862 to take over from his father-in-law as landlord of the King's Arms in Prestbury, little more than a stone's throw from Cheltenham Racecourse.
And it was in the pub garden aboard a Galloway pony called Chard, won as a prize in a raffle, that Fred first showed his potential under his father's guiding hand. More often than not, an iron fist.
Hunting with the Cotswold Hounds, the Archers made the acquaintance of gentleman amateur rider Dick Laterriere, who, aware of Fred's career ambition, in 1867 wrote to Newmarket trainer Matt Dawson. In February of the following year, a matter of weeks after his 11th birthday, Fred arrived in Newmarket to join the Scots Heath House stable. The apprenticeship was for 5 years, with a salary of 7 guineas in the first year, 9 in the second, 11 in the third, and 13 in the fourth and fifth. Dawson would provide sufficient meat, drink, and also hat, coat, and waistcoat in each year, and lodging during the same term. But there were conditions attached. He shall not commit fornication, nor contract matrimony. He shall not play at cards or dice tables. He shall not haunt taverns nor playhouses. The start of Archer's career in racing was not a happy one. Fred was a magnet for the bullies, of whom there was no shortage in Newmarket. The boy scribbled illiterate notes to his mother, telling of his misery and imploring her to fetch him from Heath House, now the base of trainer Sir Mark Prescott.
Sir Mark, Fred Archer arrived in Newmarket in 1868 as an 11-year-old boy, what would he have expected on his arrival?
I don't know whether he would have expected it, but it was seriously tough, and he'd have probably been severely bullied. When I first came to Heath House, there were all these initiation ceremonies in the 60s, and some of those older board wagemen, they behaved appallingly. And a little boy would arrive with his suitcase and his suit, and the next day he was wearing rags and they'd be in his clothes.
There was a lot of pastoral help, an unusual amount of pastoral help from the Dawson family.
I think they very much took him on board. I mean, Mr. Dawson and Mrs. Dawson were childless, and it became immediately apparent that this boy, who'd been sent to them well recommended, son of a jockey who'd won the Grand National, and they very, very soon spotted that he was tougher than he looked, and within 9 years he was a partner, which was socially very unusual at that stage.
And there was schooling from Mrs. Dawson to quite an advanced
Absolutely.
age.
She had a Sunday school here where the windows were little slits high up so the children couldn't be distracted, and the bell called them to Sunday school. And Archer was expected to attend, if he was in Newmarket, every Sunday right up till 3 weeks before he died.
And he lived here at Heath House before his marriage.
That's right.
Everything was here, including sweat boxes to help him manage his weight, which was obviously a big problem as his career progressed.
And this was his famous Archer's purgative and the extraordinary regime he put himself through. So Matt Dawson built him the what are now 3 stables, but were in those days for sweating and changing and drying in.
And this portrait is of particular significance.
Yes, it's the sort of definitive portrait, really. It's by A.L. Townsend. It was done in 1884, and it was commissioned by Fred Archer when Matt Dawson was retiring from Heath House, and he got included all the good horses of the last 2 years, and he wanted Mr. Dawson properly dressed in a swallow-tailed and top hat, out first lot. Lord Falmouth, owner, out watching work, riding a horse, binoculars slung over his shoulder. The stable jockey, Fred Archer, immaculately turned out in those wonderful stretchy trousers with the elastic underneath so that the creases were kept absolutely straight.
And a bowler hat.
And a bowler hat. And then walking round, of course, the great St. Simon, who was a very difficult horse, always had his tongue out. And he was the only horse here who you'll see who's got a leading rein as well, because you couldn't trust him even when you were leading him. And the only fellow that could ride him was Charlie Fordham, who'd lost his right eye. And I think for modern social things, it's so interesting what the lads are wearing. Jodhpurs hadn't come over from India, so they're all in trousers. Furthermore, flat caps didn't come in until just before the First War, so they're all wearing trilbies and bowlers. And even more staggering, all the stable lads are in stiff wing collars. Just incredible, isn't it?
Dawson, born in Gullane in the Firth of Forth, was already a Derby winner via Thormanby in 1860 before his move from Lambourne to Newmarket.
He possessed an unswerving instinct for fault lines in both humans and equines, and when a weakness came to light, neither man nor beast stayed at Heath House for very long. But beneath Archer's timorous exterior, the Scot divined a strength of core, and opportunities on the stable's horses soon followed.
Archer was in the early days of his apprenticeship when John Corlett, the owner and editor of the Sporting Times, the Pink 'Un as it was known, visited Heath House. Recalling Dawson pointing to a small boy on a bay horse, Corlett quoted the trainer, "There is a little fellow here I shall be able to make a jockey of. He is the pluckiest lad I ever had. He will do anything." Calling Archer out of the string, he said, "My little man, dare you jump that horse into that field? Your father used to ride over fences, and I don't see why you shouldn't." "Yes, sir," said the boy, touching his cap. He at once jumped his horse from the heath into the adjoining field and back again, and then took his place as before, a smile of satisfaction beaming over the broad, genial face of the trainer. Neither Archer's first career success on Maid of Trent in a steeplechase at Bangor late in 1869, nor his first flat winner aboard Athol Daisy at long since closed Chesterfield in September 1870 was trained by Dawson. But the Scot was responsible for Salvanos, who provided the young Archer's breakthrough victory in the 1872 Cesarewitch at Newmarket.
The London Daily News described the 15-year-old Archer as a boy with the strength of a man, but in truth, little force from the pigskin was needed. Salvanos was the beneficiary of an error by the then 77-year-old Admiral Rouse, handicapper and dictator of the turf. He carried just 5 stone 7 pounds, and he won by 4 lengths. Archer's career now had the momentum every young jockey craves. His stock was on the rise, and the steel perceived by Dawson was also beginning to show. If he judged a fellow rider at fault, Archer thought nothing of approaching the horse's owner to request the mount next time. His burgeoning repute meant he usually got it.
The 1873 campaign saw Archer finish second in the jockeys' table, the final time in his life he would not be champion. But 3 months before the season's end, tragedy struck Heath House when Tom French, stable jockey to Dawson and mentor to Archer, died. French was 29, and the cause of his death was consumption brought on by wasting. As time would tell, a chilling portent for his protégé. But French's passing did create an opportunity for Archer, and when Lord Falmouth's Atlantic contested the 2,000 guineas at Newmarket in May 1874, owner and trainer agreed to entrust the 17-year-old with the mount on the 10-to-1 shot, despite 3 stone of dead weight in the saddle. The success, one of a title-winning total of 147, ensured Archer began the following campaign as stable jockey to Heath House. Lord Falmouth, one of the sport's most powerful owner-breeders, paid an annual £100 retainer for his services.
It is a great feather in the cap of a 6-stone jockey like Archer to win such an important race as the 2,000 guineas, wrote the correspondent of the influential The Sportsman newspaper. He is now certain to get all the best mounts out of the stable.
Atlantic's 2,000 guineas victory was the first of 21 classics for Fred Archer, with no fewer than 9, including 5 derbies, coming here at Epsom.
Archer simply had no peer, not even George Fordham, his sometime tormentor over Newmarket's Rowley Mile, when it came to the unique challenge presented by this magnificent, iconic racecourse. Archer's Epsom supremacy was based on straightforward geometry. While rival jockeys took their mounts wide, a tactic that served to level out the severity of the descent, Archer dared to look the steep drop in the eye. He stuck like a clam to the inside rail and saved ground. Boiling down the mathematics, for every horse path, or lane to use a term from athletics, a Derby colt ran to the outside of another, it meant he would forfeit 1 length through the course of the 180-degree turn. In other words, 2 paths or lanes to the outside would equate to 2 lengths forfeited. Crucial margins when one considers the winning distance in each of Archer's 5 derbies: half a length, a head, a neck, a head, and 1.5 lengths. With the lengths he had saved safely in the bank, Archer could set about the business of urging his mount forward once in line for the judge's chair. A man of renowned courtesy off the track, Archer was infamously anything but on it. Dispensing with all cordiality, he would bellow and scream obscenities to unsettle rival jockeys in his path, just as in 1877, when Lord Falmouth's homebred colt Silvio overhauled Glen Arthur for a half-length Derby triumph, his jockey's first.
Archer was not 6 months out of his teens when Silvio triumphed at Epsom, but the unforgiving and ultimately fatal regime employed daily to suppress his weight was already in place.
Archer's days of doing 5 stone 7 pounds, as he had done to win the Cesarewitch 5 years earlier, had long gone, and never would they return. His height had shot up. Different accounts put him at between 5'8.5" and 5'10" tall, and his weight ballooned to 11 stone during the winter months. The scales were now his nemesis, and to keep them at bay between March and November would require the most drastic measures.
A typical breakfast was half an orange and a tablespoon of castor oil, while a dinner companion reported Archer made do with a sardine and half a glass of champagne. Archer's mixture, the scorched earth laxative concoction prepared by his own physician, Dr. John Rowland Wright, stripped the system of all that wasn't absolutely necessary to keep it going. The recipe for Archer's mixture doesn't survive, so I've come to the Royal Pharmaceutical Society in London, where John Betts, the keeper of the Society Museum, has agreed to take me through the most likely ingredients.
At the time, it would have been laxatives to kind of ease defecation, so clear out your system, or a cathartic that would accelerate defecation, so if you wanted to purge the system dramatically. Or the third option is diuretics to increase the excretion of fluid out of the body, so through the urine.
So we're not talking about speeding up the metabolism or anything like that. We're
No.
basically talking about evacuants, aren't we?
Purely clearing out the system quite dramatically, and quite harsh treatments as well.
I feel like one of the witches from Macbeth here, but we don't have eye of newt or toe of frog, but we've got some fairly exotic ingredients here.
Yeah.
Cascara sagrada.
That's sacred bark, and that's from the buckthorn plant from Western North America.
Right.
And it's called sacred bark because of how effective it was as a laxative.
Enough said. We've got aloe tincture here. I think we've got licorice tincture, rhubarb root tincture, Indian jalap. Now that's a powder I don't think I've come across before.
That's a really powerful cathartic to kind of accelerate defecation, just to clear your entire system out. To
Enough said.
Lose weight quickly.
Right. So, and these are all things substances that would have been mentioned in the medical journals of the time.
Most of these are in the British Pharmacopoeia from 1885, so that would be a reference book that pharmacists were making preparations according to official formulas.
John, all these ingredients obviously have physical effects, but would they have longer term mental consequences as well?
I think taken as a whole and going through a prolonged period of severe weight loss probably would have affected
over years
someone's mental health, because if you're that malnourished and that underweight, it would take its toll.
Well, there's no time at the present, so let's go through. I think we're going to use the castor oil as a base. I think we should then add a few of these powders. We don't have the recipe, so these are all pretty random quantities. And John, these were all, I'm assuming, whilst they were in use in the 1880s and in Victorian times, that you wouldn't be allowed to use them today.
No, most of these things would probably be banned in sport now. But in the 1880s, there's hardly any regulation of medicines at all. And often people were prescribed stuff and each individual ingredient wasn't listed, which is probably why we don't know the formula for this.
And whilst these might be potentially dangerous,
if you take too many,
they're not poisons as such.
No.
So there we are. We've got everything in there. I'm going to give that a bit of a mix round, just as Dr. Wright would have done in the 1880s. It looks absolutely disgusting.
Yeah.
Maybe later.
The Royal Pharmaceutical Society operates a policy of the responsible use of medicines. In short, don't try this at home.
Archer was prepared to test himself to the very limit and place similar demands on his mounts when the need called. Here is an example, a particularly ornate example, of one of his riding whips. It's over 2 feet in length and it's a very different beast from the BHA approved compressed foam instruments jockeys carry today. One animal not spared its use was Mully Edris, a notoriously difficult colt who was given a real lashing to give Archer one of a record 12 victories, then from just 24 races, at Royal Ascot in 1878.
2 years later, whether knowingly or by freak grisly coincidence, Mully Edris settled the score.
Archer had dismounted to move some markers on the Newmarket gallops when Mully Edris, with an "I've got you at last" look in his eye, according to the correspondent of the Sporting Times, took his chance. Mully Edris was thoroughly in earnest when he went for Archer, reported the paper. He seized Archer by the arm as a cat would a mouse. Mully Edris carried Archer in his mouth before throwing him to the turf. He then pinned the jockey to the ground with his knees before setting about him with his teeth. But as he was exacting his revenge, Mully Edris's hind leg slipped away from behind him, and hearing the cries of those who were coming to Archer's rescue, he took to flight.
His life was safe, but the muscles in Archer's right arm were badly lacerated, and the ride on the Robert Peck-trained Derby favourite Ben D'Or was surely lost. The date was the 1st of May. The Colts Classic was on the 26th. Archer, ever inclined to view his glass as half empty, even feared his career could be over. And although he made a winning return to the saddle with a double at Manchester a week before Epsom, Archer's arm was still of little use and he was in unrelenting pain. A quandary for the connections of Ben D'Or.
But when it came to a jockey for the Derby, Ben D'Or's owner, the Duke of Westminster, decided Archer with one arm was the equal of the other riders with two. So after taking industrial quantities of the mixture, he needed to shift a stone in the week leading up to Epsom. A fretful Archer, his right arm strapped up and supported by an iron stay, took the leg up on Ben D'Or, the 2-to-1 favourite in a field of 19. In the race itself, Ben D'Or's sore shins proved a handicap coming down Tattenham Hill, and it was Robert the Devil and his young jockey Rossiter who turned for home with a clear lead.
The layers shouted 10-1 on the leader, but they reckoned without the one-armed Archer, intolerant of the very suggestion of defeat, who forced the chestnut Ben D'Or home by a head.
It's often repeated that the piercing pain of his injury caused Archer to drop his whip in the finish of the 1880 Derby, but the London Evening Standard reporter's account of the final half-dozen strides, Archer is desperately close and plying his whip in his left hand, exposes this as fake news. Asked in later years to name the greatest triumph of his career, Archer was unequivocal: Ben D'Or. It was right out of the fire, I can tell you, sir. At 23, Archer had achieved national fame and the considerable fortune that goes with it. By the early 1880s, the jockey's annual income was well on the way towards the £10,000 mark, with a quarter coming in riding fees and the remainder made up of retainers and presents from the owners who were fighting for his services and from the gamblers who wanted to know which horses to bet on. Once Archer had achieved this fortune, many felt he was rather too reluctant to part with it, and he acquired the unflattering sobriquet, the Tin Man, tin being Victorian vernacular for money. While it certainly flowed in, Archer's cash very likely flowed out just as easily. He was a heavy and spectacularly unsuccessful gambler. Betting by riders wasn't encouraged by the Jockey Club at the time, but neither was it expressly outlawed. And then there was his father, Billy, no shrewd operator in business once his riding days were done, and who thought nothing of using Fred's name to secure credit. The same was almost certainly true of other family members, and when pleas for financial succour received a sympathetic response, as they invariably did, this ensured that more begging letters would be on the way.
But away from the financial pressures of his family, these were the golden years of Archer's career. He was now the dominant force of the weighing room.
12 months on from his heroics aboard Ben Dor, Archer won the Derby for the third time in 5 years. His winning mount in 1881 was 5-1 Chance Iroquois, who took advantage of a gap presented to him by rival Peregrine. The 6-5 favourite veered away from the rail to win by half a length.
Iroquois was the first American bred to win the race and carried the colours of New York tobacco millionaire Pierre Lorillard IV. News of his victory sparked wild celebrations, causing the suspension of business on Wall Street.
Now Archer was an international celebrity, and his magnetism for female attention was stronger than ever. This fact was not lost on Lady Elizabeth Hastings, whose husband, Lord George, owned Melton, Archer's triumphant mount in the 1885 Derby, a race known as Archer's masterpiece. "The way in which some women ran after Archer was amazing," wrote Lady Elizabeth. "And through all the flattery and absurdity of all these ridiculous women, his manners remained quite unspoilt. Just perfection." The formidable and razor-tongued Caroline, Duchess of Montrose, was besotted with the man nearly 40 years her junior. Carrie Red thought no more of sacking a trainer than of changing her stockings, but her admiration and affection for Archer were unswerving. Caroline's devotion to Archer is laid bold as brass in this Vanity Fair caricature, Newmarket 1885, by the cartoonist Liborio Prosperi. Given the essentially feudal structure of society in Victorian England, a relationship between a female member of the aristocracy and a jockey would be sure to set tongues wagging. But take a closer look. The picture features many of the great and good of the racing world. At its centre are the Prince of Wales, who a decade and a half later would accede to the throne as King Edward VII, and the Duchess of Manchester. Returning in victory and sporting the colours of the Duke of Westminster is Archer. But everyone in the picture seems oblivious to the great jockey's presence. Everyone, that is, except Carrie Red, unkindly known as 6 Mile Bottom, a nickname she shared with the hamlet 6 miles southwest of Newmarket. You don't need to be a spot the ball winner to work out who is the object of the Duchess of Montrose's admiring glance. The message is crystal clear. Carrie loves Fred. But Archer's love was for Matt Dawson's niece Helen Rose, Nellie, and amidst joyous celebrations, the couple were married here at All Saints Church in Newmarket on the 31st of January 1883, weeks after his 26th birthday.
Archer was Britain's most eligible bachelor, and the celebrity wedding brought Newmarket to a standstill. Special transport was put on to bring well-wishers from the surrounding villages, and the Newmarket Journal devoted an entire column to the list of wedding gifts. Having waved off the bride and groom, the whole town made merry in the evening, with a ball at the Rutland Arms and a lavish supper for stable lads at the Wagon and Horses. Their matrimonial home was Falmouth House, built by Archer at considerable cost. The building was pulled down in the 1960s. Today, the site is home to Pegasus Stables, the base of trainer James Fanshawe.
Fred came to Newmarket when he was 11 and was immediately, well, I think by the time he was 17 he was champion jockey. And he got a retainer from the Earl of Falmouth in, I think it was in 1875. And I think he was very keen that he put his money, Fred put his money somewhere sensible in bricks and mortar, and this is what he built, this beautiful yard.
Yeah, there's no expense spared here, is there? That
Well, the Victorians are very clever because, you know, if their horses were sick, they couldn't get to work. And these stables are all beautifully ventilated. Even though there's a story above here, every stable has a sort of a chimney that goes all the way up and from the ceiling to the roof, and there's a constant airflow. They face south, and the sort of detail in all the boxes is amazing. You know, if you go to, there's no sort of sharp right-handed corners and that sort of thing, and you know, lovely brass sort of door handles, that sort of thing. You know, these were so beautifully done, and you know, we're very lucky to be here.
and this, presumably, this is where Archer would have housed his grey mare Scotch Pearl. Now, there's myriad stories of a ghost riding Scotch Pearl across Newmarket. Any sightings?
The lads up in the hostel actually a few years ago, I think it's true, they called him up on a Ouija board, and he told him a winner the next day. Unblessed, he told him Unblessed was going to win, and he described where his graveyard was, and there's some various facts. I'm sure it's true because there's no way that the fellows who were involved in the Ouija boarding would have known these facts without actually having it told them. You know, it's a lovely yard, this, and when you wander around the horse in the evening, especially when it's dark, you get sort of impression that Fred's still around.
But the palatial Falmouth house, full of Archer's racing trophies previously kept in the vaults of the local bank, inevitably caught the eye of the criminal fraternity.
Burglaries in Newmarket were rife, so Archer kept a loaded revolver by his bedside, just in case.
Even those least favourably disposed towards him wouldn't have levelled a charge of self-satisfaction against Fred Archer. But Archer wouldn't have been human had he not reflected, honeymooning in Torquay, that life was sweet. 9 champion jockeys titles and 14 classic triumphs had rubber-stamped his place at the summit of his profession, success accompanied by riches beyond his imagination. And now Archer had secured his greatest prize, marriage to the woman he loved. But the clouds would soon start to gather. In under 4 years, the sky would fall in altogether. Less than 6 months after his wedding, Archer became embroiled in controversy as a result of the 1883 Derby. The form book shows Galliard, the Archer-ridden 7-2 favourite, finishing third to St Blaise at Epsom at the end of May. But the race sparked an outcry, with Archer's integrity called into question. The previous year, he had been unfairly maligned when Dutch Oven won the St Leger at 40-1. Punters accused the jockey of pulling the filly at York on her previous start. Once again, the charge was as serious as it gets for a jockey of not trying to win. And Archer was back in the dock.
In the eye of the storm was the neck runner-up Highland Chief, a 100-6 chance and the object of a £1,000 bet by his trainer, Archer's brother Charlie. Had Archer, the punter's hero, committed the cardinal sin of ensuring Galliard would not win the race as part of a crooked and ultimately unsuccessful scheme to allow Highland Chief to land the spoils and allow Charlie to cash in on his bet? It was argued the fire and brimstone employed for Archer's 3 previous Derby victories was missing that day, and newspaper reports tell us that Archer, for once, ceded the inside rail on the run to Tattenham Corner to St Blaise's jockey, Charlie Wood. The 2 riders would later be linked to a gambling conspiracy, but Archer was never charged. Tongues wagged and accusations flew, and fuel was shovelled onto the fire when it was announced that Lord Falmouth, Archer's long-time employer and the owner of Galliard, was to sell all his bloodstock interests. Was this the decision of a man in his 60s who was naturally slowing down, or furious retribution on the part of Falmouth, who sensed betrayal on the part of his most trusted ally?
The case of the 1883 Derby was never satisfactorily resolved, but Archer's great-grandson, Alex Tozzetti, is adamant the jockey was doing his best.
Well, it makes a great story, this 1883 Derby. These allegations, I think, are false on the basis that Archer normally took the inside track at Epsom, and in this case he didn't. He probably made a mistake simply in the number of races that he rode. He didn't win that particular derby, but he was always straight to himself and straight to his owners, and the overriding fact was that he wanted to win. Whatever horse he was on, whatever horse he bet on, he wanted to win on the horse that he rode. Some great examples of where he rode against his own money, and one was where he rode westward at Windsor in 1884. He won that, and he beat the horse that he'd put £500 bet on. £500 was a lot of money in those days. So it just goes to show that even if he was betting, his will to win on the horse on the day was paramount.
Archer's detractors were apt to paint the jockey as a miser, but Tozzetti defends his great-grandfather against a charge of meanness and also of being part of the illegal jockey's gambling ring.
So the Jockey Club was very powerful in the days of Fred Archer and ran racing. And I think if they had the evidence, then they would have progressed with a charge. But it seemed that they didn't have the evidence that Fred was involved in any such jockey ring. Let's look at his meanness. His meanness, I think, came from the fact that he earned a lot of money. And this is someone that was brought up in a fairly deprived family. He was a stable boy in Prestbury when he first started, and then earned a fortune in all the races that he won. He actually was very kind with his money, and he wasn't very good dealing with his money, but he was very kind, and he looked after his family, he looked after his father and his mother, and people close to him. He also looked after some of his fellow jockeys who were hard up. So I think with his money, he actually looked after people. To be honest, he didn't have time to think about money. He probably didn't care about his money. He was more interested in winning.
Lord Falmouth was known to be none too impressed by Archer's ride aboard Galliard in the 1883 Derby, but he did put the jockey up on the small number of horses he kept in training. Indeed, Blancheland's 6-1 on win at Newmarket in 1886 would be the very last of Archer's life. But the one that got away, and the horse at the centre of the unthinkable, a sacking for the great jockey, did not belong to Falmouth, but to the Duke of Portland. And he would go down as one of the greatest horses in turf history, St Simon. Archer had been on board for each of St Simon's races as a 2-year-old, a campaign he finished unbeaten in 5 outings, but he lost the ride after a gallop at Newmarket early in the spring of St Simon's 3-year-old career in 1884. Sensing the notoriously temperamental colt was refusing to apply himself, a trait trainer Matt Dawson generously referred to as electricity, Archer gave his mount a dig in the ribs with his spurs. We saw him shoot out, tear up the gallop, dash through another trainer's lot of horses, scatter them like pigeons before a fox, and disappear from view, related the Duke. When St Simon did consent to stop, near the entrance of Newmarket High Street, a shaken Archer remarked, "He's not a horse, he's a blooming steam engine." In the summer that followed, Archer could only look on in frustration as St Simon, ridden by Charlie Wood, won the 1884 Gold Cup at Ascot by 20 lengths. He would later ruefully describe the horse, who retired unbeaten after 9 races, as the best he had ridden. It was a case, and a rare case as far as Archer was concerned, of what might have been. But his travails on the track were mere minor irritations beside the tragedies that befell Archer's personal life. In March 1878, his brother William suffered fatal injuries in a three-runner selling hurdle at Cheltenham. When Nellie became pregnant in the spring of 1883, the couple decided they would name the child after Archer's deceased older brother. But when the infant was born the following January, he survived for just a few hours. Although herself seriously ill, Nellie recovered and was soon pregnant once again. The following November, when Archer returned to the weighing room after landing Liverpool's Autumn Cup aboard the Duchess of Montrose's Thebais, there was a telegram. Nellie had given birth to a daughter, and both mother and child were doing well. Returning to Newmarket by train, Archer pondered his good fortune. "I think I was the happiest man that evening that ever lived," he later told a journalist. "I said to myself, I wonder why I should be so blessed." But on his arrival home at Falmouth House, Archer witnessed the most harrowing scene. Nellie, attended by Archer's sister Emily and the family practitioner Dr. Wright, was writhing in violent convulsions. Additional help was called for, but it was to no avail. At 5 minutes to midnight on Friday the 7th of November 1884, Nellie died in agony and unable to recognise the husband who was by her side. She was 23 years old. The remaining 2 weeks of the flat season passed Archer by. He sat in a chair and stared without focus into the distance, and when he did speak, he talked of suicide. A plan was quickly put in place to get the jockey away from Newmarket, away from Britain. With two companions, provisions having been made for the healthy newborn daughter Nellie Rose, he set sail on the SS Bothnia for New York. During a 4-month break, Archer and his entourage travelled across America, sightseeing, hunting and gambling. Archer let his hair down in every conceivable way before returning to Britain to throw himself into his work, with spectacular results. 4 classics, including a 4th Derby aboard Melton, and 246 victories made 1885 the best year of Archer's career. The haul was a record that would stand until surpassed by Gordon Richards in 1933, and all this riding at 8 stone 8 pounds. Although 1886 yielded a reduced total of 170 winners, Archer duly secured a 13th consecutive jockey's title, and he partnered the incomparable Ormond to capture the Derby, his 5th, and the St Leger, his 21st and final classic. But even this treasure trove wasn't enough to persuade Archer back from the cliff edge. His betting was going from bad to worse. With a loss of £30,000 for the season, Archer decided to smash his way out of trouble in one hit aboard the Duchess of Montrose's St Mirren in the 1886 Cambridgeshire. As the field entered the closing stages, it was Archer, putting up £1 overweight on St Mirren, who held the lead. But in the final strides, Tiny White and 22-to-1 shot the Sailor Prince got up to land the spoils by a head.
Archer's spirits were sinking into the sand. He blamed himself for St Mirren's defeat, came off worse in a brush with the taxman, and fell out with his long-term friend, confidant and prominent racing figure, Captain James Matchell.
And it was here on the South Downs at the now defunct Lewes Racecourse on Thursday the 4th of November 1886 that Archer competed for the very last time. Although he'd complained of a chill during the 2-day meeting at Brighton, he'd ridden no winners from 6 mounts during the Tuesday and Wednesday, Archer remained in East Sussex. But at Lewes, things went from bad to worse. Lucretius, the 13-8 favourite, returned third in the Rothschild Plate. Half an hour later, Tommy Tittlemouse at 13-8 on was well beaten behind Whipper in the Castle Plate. Archer had had enough. He went back to the weighing room and, accompanied by trainer Martin Gurry, returned to Newmarket by train. There he consulted with physician Dr. Wright, who diagnosed typhoid fever. Physically, Archer's condition improved over the weekend, but mentally there was no way out. Shortly after 2 p.m. on Monday the 8th of November 1886, 2 years and 1 day after the death of his beloved Nellie, Archer took matters into his own hands.
The means were within easy reach. The 6-chamber revolver kept as a defence against burglars. At the inquest into his death, the jury concluded that Archer had killed himself while in a state of temporary insanity. His sister, Emily Coleman, described the terrible final moments to the court.
I heard a noise, and looking round, saw that my brother was out of bed and had something in his hand. I ran to him, and when I saw it was a revolver, tried to push it away. The revolver was in his left hand. He then threw his right arm around my neck and fired the revolver with his left hand. I saw him doing it, but could not stop him. He seemed awfully strong. He then fell flat on his back.
News of Archer's suicide spread like wildfire through Newmarket and beyond. Special editions of the London papers were printed to report the tragedy, and buses stopped so that incredulous passengers could read the headlines on street vending newsboys' stands. The name of Fred Archer was so well known all over the world, reported the following day's Daily Telegraph, that his sudden demise was looked upon as a great calamity and was the chief topic of conversation among all classes during the evening. The Times went further. A great soldier, a great statesman, a great poet, even a great royal prince might die suddenly without giving half so general a shock as has been given by the news of the tragical death of Fred Archer. News of his death has come with a sense of shock and almost personal loss, literally to millions. The funeral at All Saints, where Archer and Nellie had married 3 years earlier, was predictably a grand and sombre affair. The great and good of racing were represented, along with royalty. Among the funeral flowers, heartbreakingly, was a mass of violets, with baby's fondest love to her father. The same floral tribute had been placed a week earlier on the 2nd anniversary of her death on Mother Nellie's grave.
Archer rests alongside Nellie in Newmarket Cemetery, just across from the Rowley Mile racecourse. His legacy in British culture reflects his status as the sporting star of the Victorian era. Archer memorabilia was still in production over a decade after his death, and the jockey was the first sportsman to have his own waxwork in Madame Tussauds in London. Archer even made his way into the English language. The salutation, "Archer's up!" between Victorian cab drivers, confirming that all was well.
But despite the 2,748 winners, the 5 derbies, the 13 championships and the vast fortune that went with them, all was, in truth, far from well in the brilliant but brutally brief life of Fred Archer, the tragic hero.